its own resistance group. And then once it could control its neighborhood, it could create its own discourse in its own political bodies. Therefore, from April to July 2011, disparate and peripheral local councils and militias spontaneously arose throughout Libya to contest the regime on a city-by-city basis. They also could use the internet and satellite TV to put forth their own narratives of the uprisings. Unsurprisingly, all groupings proclaimed themselves to be wholly new and revolutionary. Yet, of course, they largely drew their solidarity networks from pre-existing cleavages in Libyan society, such as locality, religion, regionalism, and tribe. Many of these groupings did not even swear allegiance to the NTC. Among those that did, they did not disappear as separate entities merely because Gaddafi was defeated. Hence, the process of overthrowing the tyrant was transformative of the Libyan social landscape. Previously buried social cleavages were transformed into the sites of revolutionary mobilization. Therefore, in post-Gaddafi Libya, the most powerful government security forces, like the Libya Shield or the Supreme Security Council, are actually comprised of different militias with different ideological and tribal makeups. And hence, they're more likely to follow the brigade commander than the authority of the central government, which they're supposedly reporting to. This problem was further compounded by the fact that the new central government, the NTC, was inclined to compromise, and it hesitated to take bold actions out of fear of becoming unpopular. Sometimes these endeavors veered towards outright appeasement and have led to the accusations that the NTC is actually populist. What have they done? It's made the country ungovernable, and it's also emboldened the opponents of the central government. The most famous example is that in the summer of 2012, the Federalists said that they would boycott the elections if the Constitutional Committee would be selected by the GNC, as it was laid out in the Constitutional Declaration. They followed out these demands by making violence. They made a blockade at the symbolic point of Wadi al-Ahmar, which celebrates Cyrenaica from Tripolitania. The NTC sadly caved into this blackmail and amended the Constitution just 2 days before the election to comply with Federalist demands. Now, it shouldn't surprise any observer that if one militia or pressure group holds the government hostage using blackmail, and then its demands are successfully met, this tactic is instantly copied by many other armed groups. And this precedent allows anyone to threaten violence to cause their demands to be met. Moreover, it legitimizes those demands because people are able to say, we're acting on behalf of the revolutionary people. We fought Gaddafi. You guys were sitting in suits in the Tavesti Hotel in Benghazi. What did you do to overthrow Gaddafi? Look, we're not just causing a blockade on this road or invading the offices of the parliament. We are the representatives of the revolutionary people. So the militias have become something like Jacobins, pushing the revolution forward to its horrible extreme, be it Robespierre or Danton. What we think is that this has caused a genuine free-for-all struggle and a discourse. It's not just a struggle for power. The struggle for post-Gaddafi Libya is a struggle for legitimacy and a discourse. What is post-Gaddafi Libya? This tension caused by the periphery's rejection of the rhetoric authority of the new center is still playing out. Most famously now, in May 2013, various militias surrounded the government ministries in Tripoli, bringing the central government to its knees, forcing them to vote for the debilitating political isolation law, which has essentially forced elected members of the central government to step down in favor of others who will be more pliant to the demands of the periphery. Now that we have a decent grasp of the struggle between the center and the periphery since 2011, let's jump back for the historical component and see how this struggle has recreated power relationships that prevailed in Libya for more than a century. Since the Ottoman reconquest in 1835, an Ottoman governor has ruled in Tripoli. However, local notables have held power in Tripolitania's coastal towns, and they never paid taxes to the Sublime Porte, nor did they allow their tribes to be conscripted. Furthermore, in eastern Libya, Cyrenaica, the Ottomans didn't hold control except for a few coastal cities. In fact, in the interior, the Senussi Sufi order held sway, and they cultivated their own tax collecting, educational, and even public works bureaucracies. the Senussis were such a sovereign state that they entered into arrangements with foreign powers. Historically, these discrete power brokers of local notables, the Senussi order, the Ottomans, they would occasionally unite, such as to fight Italian colonization. But even at these times, the various localities, the various differences between the localities could not be patched over solely in the name of fighting an outside invader. In fact, a degree of Libyan unity and institution building first came about only as a result of a period of collaboration and a shift in colonial policy by Italy towards the end of World War I. Interestingly, it was in eastern Libya that the Senussi order, which had been the most ardent opponents of the Italians, briefly cooperated with them, becoming something akin to a client state from 1917 to 1921. While in western Libya, under the Leggi Fondamentali, the disparate forces of western Libya formed the Tripolitanian Republic, which interestingly, although fleeting, was the first experiment in republican governance in the Arab world. It lasted only a few years because it was fragmented between rival power centers such as Misrata, Tripoli, and Jebel Nafusa, and hence the internal tensions destroyed it even before the rise of fascism. In various ways, this Tripolitanian Republic very much resembles the post-QADHAFI experiments such as the NTC and now the GNC. Both were committed to democracy and respecting prevailing international norms of conduct. Secondly, both attempted to rule while lacking a Weberian monopoly on force. Thirdly, in both instances, the primary political forces of the Republic, such as Ramadan Aswehli or Suleiman Baroni in the time of the Tripolitanian Republic, or their more modern equivalents such as the Zintani militias or the Misratan militias or the Libya Shield Force, they didn't abandon their separate power bases outside of formal politics. And this has meant that on the one hand, they sit and they hold ministries, and on the other hand, they wage power outside these formal ministries. Lastly, different sub-state power brokers conduct their own foreign policies. In these ways and others, the period of Libyan self-governance is an important model for today. Attempts to create a political umbrella grouping resulted in tensions between different power brokers, not their unity. Tensions between Berbers and Arabs, between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, were at their height at the time of the limited experiment of self-governance, the Tripolitanian Republic. This meant that when the experiment failed, a unified anti-Italian jihad was impossible, and only the Senussi Sufi order could coherently oppose the Italians, making the very resistance to the Italians exacerbate pre-existing cleavages in Libyan society, particularly the primary cleavages between a unified East and a fractured West. This dynamic is tragically illustrated today when the anti-Qaddafi rebellion has only further exacerbated previous cleavages in Libyan society, and each social force has undergone its own uprising. The only shared objective was the removal of Qaddafi. It therefore follows, with Qaddafi out of the way, regional and religious tensions are being enshrined and exacerbated by the competitive dimensions of electoral politics and the constitutional process. So with those World War I era precedents out of the way, you can see that Libya's post-colonial history has continued this same sense and trend of fragmentation. During the British military administration, 1942 to 51, and later the Western-aligned monarchy, 1951 to 69, tribally organized Cyrenaican elements, backed by the Senussi Sufi order, shifted power away from the old Ottoman centers of Tripoli to new centers such as Benghazi and Baida. And as soon as those new centers were established, new peripheries rebelled against them. British policies in Cyrenaica played upon and exacerbated pre-existing cleavages, such as urban-rural, or tribal, or generational between young and old. The British philosophy of building native institutions in what they considered tribal Cyrenaica, but not in what they considered non-tribal Tripolitania, created institutional gaps that made the union of the two provinces deeply challenging in the wake of the British exit. With independence in 1951, the wealthy and educated urban traders representing the old Ottoman center in Tripoli progressively lost control, most noticeably as a result of siding with the Italian colonialists or backing Egyptian-inspired Arab nationalism against the British and the Senussis. This laid the stage for Gaddafi to come to power in 1969. He professed himself a great unifier. Yet rather than unifying, he relied on the Magarha and Gaddafi tribesmen to staff his security services. Therefore, his rule favored Fezzan, Sirte, and Tripoli over Cyrenaica, laying bare his rhetorical claims to unite Libyans. Many hoped that Gaddafi's tyranny would unite Libyans in opposition to him. Sadly, not even this sliver of a positive legacy can have said to come to pass. In short, deep study of Libyan history over the past 150 years reveals a cyclical shift of power between the center and the periphery. Each time the periphery dislodges the center, it gradually constitutes a new center, which is in turn dislodged. This is similar to the typology described by the 14th century Islamic sociologist Ibn Khaldun. The 2011 Libyan uprisings witnessed not one, but two such cycles, as peripheral Benghazi conquered the center, only to see itself quickly supplanted by new diffuse loci of power to the west. In short, as a result of the uprisings, Libya has shifted from a decentralized dictatorship back to its more traditional power structure, a weak center having difficulty making inroads with a rebellious and disunited periphery, which does not recognize its claim to be the sole legitimate sovereign. Local notables, tribal groups, and militias are all vying to keep the center from extending its authority to their fiefdoms. And this analysis explains why disparate social groups can only unite temporarily to prevent the center from gaining power over them, not permanently to constitute a new center. In summation, this struggle for the post-Gaddafi future that I've elaborated and tried to sketch is not taking place in a vacuum. The Libyan government's inability to control the flow of arms and jihadists across its borders affects neighboring states like Algeria and Mali. Libyan weapons and jihadists have recently been found in Syria. And the inability to bring security and coherent institutions affects the type of international business and diplomacy which can and cannot be transacted in Libya. To help untangle how events in Libya were affected by outside actors, and how Libya in turn affects the rest of the world, we now turn to Ambassador Richard Northern, who was on the ground in Libya when the uprisings began. He's going to tell us a little bit about his personal experience of the uprisings, as well as his perspective on the role of foreign powers in both the key times of supporting the uprisings with the no-fly zone, and also the reconstruction process and the struggle for the post-Gaddafi future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Well, Jason has set the Libyan uprisings in a historical context and described the overarching theme of our book. In my own chapter in the book, I wrote about the role of the external powers, or some of them, and their interests and their objectives in Libya. Rather than summarize that or go into too much detail of that, because I hope you'll all have a chance to read the book very soon, I thought I'd just make a few more personal remarks today by way of illustration, certainly not a comprehensive analysis, about what it felt like to be in Tripoli when the uprisings happened, and it certainly felt dramatic at the time, and then a few comments about the impact of the uprisings and their historical background on the situation today. What felt really remarkable at the time, and probably even more so now looking back, was quite how quickly relatively small-scale demonstrations in Benghazi from 15 February onwards, which started really just in protest at the arrest of a civil activist. They didn't have a major political motivation at the beginning. How quickly they escalated into a full-scale challenge to the government's authority in many centres across Libya, and how ill-prepared the government in Libya was to tackle them, certainly at first. On about 10 February, I think calls first appeared on external websites calling for a demonstration against the government in line with what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt in Benghazi on 17 February, which was the anniversary of a large-scale riot in Benghazi in which a number of people died in 2006. At that point, nobody in Tripoli was unduly concerned. The government seemed in complete control. The streets were calm. People were watching what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt on their satellite TVs. But otherwise, it felt another world across the border. 10 days later, the streets of Tripoli were deserted in the daytime. Shops were shuttered. It was virtually impossible to buy food. Police stations were burnt overnight. Civil service and even the dreaded internal security people were too frightened to turn up and be seen at their stations in the daytime. Whole districts of the capital in the evening were given over to running battles between demonstrators, often quite small numbers of brave students and young people, and militia which the government sent out to attack them, who fired at anything that moved, so everybody felt very unsafe. And in fact, the biggest crime was carrying a laptop or a mobile phone, because the big fear of the government was that people would be taking pictures of disturbances and uploading them onto the internet and giving access to the international media. In fact, one particularly frightening episode I can recall was that my Dutch colleague, the Dutch ambassador in Tripoli, who was staying in a hotel very close to my house, stepped out onto the balcony of his hotel room at night to get a better signal on his satellite phone talking to The Hague, and was met with a hail of gunfire from militia in the streets below. He died back in his room, fortunately, and was not hurt, but when he recovered, he counted 40 bullet holes in the inside walls of his hotel room, so it's a narrow escape. But waving a satellite phone or a camera was a red rag. For a few days, there was an extraordinary power vacuum. The government leadership had been caught totally unprepared. None of the senior figures in the government were seen on television or around, and normal government agencies seem not to be functioning. A few weeks later, of course, the government recovered its equilibrium, took back control of the streets, and unfortunately in the following months imposed even greater repression on Tripoli. But it was a